Hi, and welcome to Introduction to Research Methods. My name is Rob Leone, and today we're going to be talking about research designs. You know, in political science, we are used to having different philosophical debates about the world in which we live in. Some people just simply have different ideological orientations than other people. And sometimes it's hard for us to figure them out. Sometimes we just don't understand why they think a particular way. And I want you to know that in research methods, we actually have the same kinds of debates. Now, they're not the same ideological debates per se as they are in political science, but we do have a different way of thinking about the way we live and the world in which we live, and that does transcend into research methods and how we conduct our research. So today you're going to learn about some of those philosophical debates in research methods with the hope that you're going to better understand how you are as a researcher. So just like in political science, where we're having these big ideological debates about the world in which we live in, we're going to apply that same kind of debate and rigor to the different ways in which we can do research methods.
A few things that we're going to cover. First of all, we're going to look at the relationship between theory and research, and certainly a lot of what's driven in social science research is the testing of theories and the refutation of those theories. Then we're going to look at the distinction between epistemology and ontology, which is a concept that is popularly thought about in the philosophy of science. We're going to look at influences on research design, criteria for evaluating social research, and assessing qualitative and quantitative research. So let us begin with the relationship between theory and research. So there's no better place to start our journey in research methods than with this question of, what is a theory? A theory is an explanation of observed regularities and patterns. What we're looking for in theories are verifiable statements, and if they're verifiable statements, that means that at some point they may not be true, they may not be verifiable and can be refuted, which is an important component of a theory. We test theories to see if they are in fact true and hold in this circumstance, and if we can change circumstances, does the theory still hold to be true? And that's something that we do in the social sciences all the time. Theories define key terms, they provide descriptions of phenomena of interest, and they're composed of relational statements. So we're looking at the relationship between variables when we're talking about theories, and we're going to learn about those variables, particularly independent, dependent variables in this course. When you're looking at social science research, you may come across this distinction between mid-range theories and grand theories. Now, generally speaking, most of the research you're going to encounter in your undertakings in university are going to be that of mid-range theories and testing of mid-range theories. So most social science researchers just assume that mid-range theories are simply the theories that we look at on an ongoing basis. But the distinction between a mid-range theory and a grand theory, for example, certainly is the scope. Grand theories would be looking at social structures, they'll be looking at how society has developed. And if you look at just simply the terminology between grand theories and mid-range theories, grand being a macro-level analysis and mid-range theories being more meso-level analysis, you get the sense that the research that's undertaken to examine and explore and develop a grand theory is a far greater undertaking than that you'll simply encounter on an ongoing basis. So it really is those mid-range theories that we look at in the social sciences. We need theories. Theories are a necessity, particularly in social science research, but in also understanding the world in which we live in. If we didn't have theories, we would be simply looking at the world by describing the events that happen without actually putting any real links in place. It's the relationship between variables and looking at those links that allows us to gain a greater appreciation of why things exist and for what purpose do they serve. And that is one of the reasons why we utilize theory in the social sciences and why theories drive the research in which we do, because it allows us to gain further knowledge about our social world. Now, through the course of your research, you're going to have to decide whether you like doing inductive research or deductive research. These are two different ways in which research can be undertaken. And you might have a preference on how you see research unfolding for you, and your preference might be different than somebody else's preference. That might be a direct relation or reaction to the way you see the world and what we'll discuss next, your epistemological and ontological orientations. In inductive research, we look at and we discover our findings and observations in our social world that we find interesting. We obviously would note what those findings and observations are, and based on the collection of findings and observations, we develop a theory. In deductive research, you're doing the opposite. You're starting with the theory. Your theory will be a relationship that you're interested in, a relationship between variables, and you're going to test that theory. And through the test that you put that theory through, you're going to develop findings and observations. Those findings and observations, in turn, will allow you to understand whether the theory still holds, or whether you have to actually rethink the theory and the relationship of variables that you previously thought were something of interest. So there are two different ways of conducting research, two different methods, both equally valid, and both would depend upon, your preference would depend upon how you view research and how you view the world, and what do you think may be the appropriate way of doing things. And in this class, you're going to be able to experiment with those. You don't have to decide what you prefer today, but it's something you might want to keep in mind.
As you can tell, you're going to be looking at how you are as a researcher and the kind of research that you naturally gravitate toward. But you're also going to get some tips on how you can succeed in your undergraduate work. And one tip that I will provide to you right now is that you sometimes write these research essays, and your professor writes a comment that says something like, "Your paper is overly descriptive and not analytical enough." Well, if it's not analytical enough, there's usually a couple of reasons for that. One reason is that it's not theoretical enough, or it doesn't engage in a theoretical debate. Another reason would be that you're not contrasting variables. There's no contrastation of ideas that's found within your paper. So if you can apply theory and contrast variables, you're going to avoid that comment that your paper is overly descriptive.
On to our next section, we're going to look at epistemology and ontology. These are two important words to the study of science and the social sciences, and we're going to explore them in some detail. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the lecture, there are different ways of looking at how to do science and scientific research, as well as how do you do social scientific research. And can you do social scientific research in the same way as scientific research is a natural debate and an ongoing debate in research methods. And earlier when I talked about this, I said, there might be a way of understanding people's political attitudes by understanding their ideological predispositions. Well, in the research methods context, our ideological predispositions can be linked to our epistemology. Epistemology is the scientific study of knowledge. Notions of what can be known and how knowledge can be acquired are within the realm of one's epistemology. And at the heart of epistemological debates is a debate between what is acceptable knowledge in social sciences versus what appears in the natural sciences. A prominent epistemology in the social sciences is positivism. Positivists believe that the social sciences should follow the lead of what occurs in the natural sciences. Only things that can be seen or heard is acceptable knowledge according to positivists, and it's acceptable knowledge because it can be empirically tested. Social science studies from a positivist perspective can be derived from induction or deduction. There's no real preference given to the mode of conducting the research. However, there is a process of objectivity and intersubjectivity, which suggests that researchers of different values would reach similar conclusions despite their different values. And what this means is that the goal of positivist research is to avoid normative statements and normative understandings of our social world, because those opinions cannot be verified by the senses. Standing in contrast to positivism is interpretivism, and interpretivism is also an epistemology. It contrasts quite specifically to positivism and the approach of linking social and natural sciences together. What interpretivists like to do is they like to look for the subjective meaning of people's actions. Seeking an emphatic understanding and interpretation of human behavior is something that interpretivists do. So their approach to science and the study of social sciences is quite different than the positivists. They look for that meaning, and that meaning is shaped by their understanding of human behavior, which is an important aspect of their research. Ontology is one of those things that, like epistemology, we debate in the social sciences. And one thing that we can say about ontology is it's certainly a more philosophical debate, because it questions the nature of being. Questions that we ask, are things real? Is there a universal truth of what exists? And some of that might seem a little strange to us, though. What do you mean? Like, things aren't real? Or there aren't any universal truths that we know to exist? And generally speaking, the debate about the philosophy of science breaks down between objectivists on one side and subjectivists or constructivists on the other. Objectivists believe that there is a social reality, that there are things we know to be true and real. Subjectivists, on the other hand, or constructivists, believe that there are no facts, just interpretations of reality. And those interpretations are going to vary from person to person, because we interpret things as human beings differently than others. And so we obviously are going to have two very different and diverging focuses of our research if we have different ontological understandings of the world.
So epistemology and ontology, it's research methods equivalent to ideology. And you're going to feel differently about the different kinds of epistemological orientations people have as researchers, and you're going to feel the same way about their ontology and the way they philosophically think about the research in the world that we live in. And the point I want to re-emphasize is the fact that people are going to approach their research in different ways. And they may approach that research in ways that don't align with the way we see the world. But that doesn't discredit the research because we happen to think that positivism or interpretivism might not be the way in which we see the world. Quite the contrary. The proof is in the pudding. The proof is not in the philosophical, epistemological orientations of an individual. It's in the methods. It's in the process by which they undertake their research. That, in a nutshell, is where we're going to focus our efforts in understanding what is good research and what is bad research, regardless of someone's epistemological or ontological orientations. But we talk about them today because it's important for you to get a sense of what you may feel to be your epistemological outlook. What is your ontological outlook when it comes to research in the social sciences?
So let's move on to the influences in research design that are obviously going to vary depending upon our epistemological and ontological understandings of how research ought to be conducted. The first concept that we'll look at is this concept of values. Is it possible for researchers to be completely value-free? Think about that in terms of the professors that you've had, and if you can think about that in terms of what they're teaching you, how they're teaching you, why they're selecting the readings that they're selecting, those same kinds of questions can appear in research as well. So values can intrude at all points of the research process. A researcher can determine who gets studied, what gets studied, when it is studied, where is it studied, why might it be studied, and how to study something. So at any given point in any one of those periods, with any one of those questions, the values do have the possibility of affecting how research is conducted. And values often are driving forces between how people come to understand their own epistemology and ontology as well. So you have to be quite cognizant of the role values play. Particularly, we have to be concerned about politics and research. Researchers like to take sides. Research funding comes from sources that may have political agendas. Some of it comes from government sources. Others come from private sources. We have to understand where they're coming from, and does the fact that the granting of the research dollars affects the results? And we ask those questions all the time. Getting access to research subjects in organizations may be difficult. Certainly if that is the case in politics, you might have some degree of success getting to talk to some civil servants, but if you want to talk to politicians, the political apparatus is often more guarded, and you might be more likely to have access to these certain individuals once they retire rather than when they are available in office. So there's a concern about how people and organizations will be perceived in research. So if you are going to talk to somebody in politics, for example, they're going to be very concerned about how what they say is going to be interpreted by the people doing the research and the audience of the research as well. So we sometimes find ourselves restricting publication of findings as a result of that. Now, there's a good example that happened with the Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, who recently had the opportunity of being part of a documentary. Actually, the documentary was about her and her government, particularly with respect to how they were creating the 2015 Ontario budget. And the documentary came forth, was produced, but when it came for final signatures by Kathleen Wynne and her office, the office declined to actually allow the documentary to go through. And the reason for that is because they were concerned about what the remarks and the way those remarks were portrayed in the documentary would be received by the public. And so you have to understand some of the political context that research takes place in. So let's go over some practical considerations that you should be aware of in your research as well. First of all research, whether that's a article that's ready to be published in a journal or an undergraduate essay, should have a research question that needs answering. For example, why do political science undergraduates hate math? It's been a question that's preoccupied me for some time, but one that I'll probably take the time to answer in my academic career. You also have to understand that research questions should be linked and match the design and method of the research project. So it's not just simply enough to have a research question, but the research question has to make sense for what you're doing in your research project. And if there is an incongruency there, it's an easy criticism for a professor to level against your essay, or a criticism that one could level against an academic journal that one seeks to be article that needs to be published. The number of subjects may determine whether you conduct a qualitative or quantitative analysis. If you have a lot of subjects, you are able to perhaps get a lot of data to manipulate statistics, and by doing so, it allows you to use a quantitative methodology. Whereas if you have fewer subjects, the only way you're going to allow your research to be reasonably reliable is to spend some time talking to those subjects. So in qualitative analysis, you're not looking for more subjects, but you're looking for quality. You're looking for good descriptions. You're looking to have good conversations with the subjects that you're studying. And the final practical consideration that you need to be aware of is the time constraints that might be apparent. Timing, as they say, is everything. The same as holds true for research as well. And you have to recognize the context of which your analysis and research is taking place. And so take note of what the time is, take note of the time constraints, because these are certainly questions that might be asked of your research.
So here's a rule. Every research project needs a research question. So when you're writing research papers, put in a research question. Why are you actually writing this paper? And you have to convince the reader of that paper that you're actually doing it because you want to answer a particular question that's been itching at the back of your mind for some time. And not only should you write that question or any research project that you undertake, but you should answer that question. And answer that question succinctly and emphatically. And the rest of the paper should just be about how that answer is derived, where you got that answer from. So not only should you be analytical and not descriptive in your work, but you also should embed a research question in your research papers and answer those research questions. By doing that, you have the basis of a strong argument that you're going to form, and that your professors are just simply going to love your papers.
Now it's time to take a look at the criteria for evaluating social research. Now there are 3 words that I want you to take special note of because these words are going to come up throughout the course. They are reliability, replicability, and validity. Now, reliability tries to assess whether the same result would be realized if the research technique were used multiple times. IQ tests, for example, are popular because they offer good reliability. If they produce different results, then people would use them. So that's just a good example of how reliability can be used in research to give ordinary readers and consumers of research the confidence that what is being tested it does in fact measure what is intended. The second of those major words that I just discussed is replicability. Replicability speaks to whether a study can be conducted again by another researcher and whether that other researcher who's conducting that study yields the same results. And if they yield the same results, then we can say with confidence that a study can be replicated and that the findings are actually even more robust because more than one researcher and more than one research project came up with the same conclusions. Simply put, the idea behind replicability is to try to discover whether results match prior evidence. And it also allows us to have a check on whether the original study was conducted properly. And if it wasn't conducted properly, then doing that study over again can obviously magnify the problem of a flawed research study in the first instance. Validity is the last of those 3 words that I want you to take note of. Validity is concerned with the integrity of the conclusions, and measurements of validity ask whether a measurement really does what it says it measures. There are 2 different types of validity. There's internal validity and external validity. Internal validity assesses the causality of the variables, whether they make sense with respect to each other. And external validity discovers whether results would be similar if applied to a natural setting. Can the results of the study be generalized beyond the people or cases analyzed by the researcher? That right there is one specific question that we ask in social science research all the time. When we're criticizing essays, when we're criticizing papers to be published, that's one of the questions that we look at. Are the facts cherry-picked? Are the people being selected for a particular reason that leads to a particular conclusion? So we ask these questions of validity on an ongoing basis. And that question, can the results of the study be generalized beyond the people or cases analyzed by the researcher? We ask that question to measure validity. Reliability, replicability, and validity are 3 words that are crucial to our understanding of social science research and being able to understand them. But there are a few things that you need to understand. First of all, when we talk about reliability and replicability and validity, these are terms that are most often associated with quantitative research. Again, quantitative research involves the statistical manipulation of numbers. So the replicability and reliability and validity can often be measured in the projects that we bring forward. Qualitative researchers, on the other hand, depend on a different set of assumptions based upon their epistemological orientations and their ontological orientations. And some may go so far as to completely disregard validity, replicability, and reliability. Instead, they would argue that what we should be looking at is the degree of trustworthiness in the researcher and in the researcher's subjects to actually detail what exactly is transpiring and when. So if we're looking at measures of trustworthiness, there's a few ways in which we can achieve it. First of all, we look at credibility. How believable are the findings? The next thing we can look at is transferability. Do the findings apply to other people and contexts? The third thing we'll look at is dependability. Are the findings likely to be consistent over time? And lastly, we look at confirmability. Would another investigator looking at the same factors come to the same conclusion? And if you can determine those sorts of those four criteria, you are on your way to establishing trustworthiness in the data.
Reliability, replicability, validity, trustworthiness. These are all words, all terms, all concepts that we're going to encounter throughout this course, because what we need to have a feeling about is whether the research that we're reading is good or bad. Has it been done well or not done so well? And the way in which we do that is to measure whether there is validity, whether we can replicate a study, whether the information that's being relayed to us is reliable in a particular manner, that the way we construe or conceive reliability to be. And if we're more inclined to do qualitative research, we're going to ask questions about trustworthiness. Can we have confidence in the data that we're using and the conclusions that we're deriving from that data? That's the journey that we're on in research methods, to understand how these concepts apply to the various research methodologies. And so take some time to understand these concepts, because we're going to be coming back to them periodically throughout the term.
Final section, we'll look at assessing qualitative and quantitative research. Now, we've been talking about quantitative and qualitative research for the entire lecture, so I think it's an appropriate time to sit down and actually define what they mean so that everyone is aware. First of all, quantitative research involves the statistical manipulation of variables. So that means it involves math. It usually involves large amounts of data and respondents. The data could come from a researcher, it could come from a library data set that's available for people to use, whether it's professors or students. For example, the World Value Survey is something that a lot of universities have at their disposal for researchers to conduct their research. Qualitative research, on the other hand, usually involves an assessment of small amounts of people within a situation. It's usually conducted by describing and asking questions. And this is obviously much more limited in scope, so quantity versus quality, it's a difference in research methods as well. And you'll find in this course that there is that distinction between quantitative and qualitative research that pops out through the duration of the course. So it's good to be aware of what they mean. In terms of experimental design, we are preoccupied with the differences between quantitative and qualitative research right away. First of all, quantitative research involves the comparison between experimental and control groups on the dependent variable. Now, as soon as you hear experimental and control group, you might think about, well, this is something that happens in the natural sciences. And if you remember, our epistemology, or discussion on epistemology, suggested that positivists believed that the understanding of scientific research should closely approximate what happens in the social sciences as well. So you won't be the first person to conclude that quantitative research and positivism are quite linked together. Qualitative research, on the other hand, experiments are not used in qualitative research, but it may be a method used to further understand why something occurred. So qualitative researchers don't completely dismiss the experimental control group model, but it is something that they obviously aren't as frequently immersed in as quantitative researchers. There's also something called cross-sectional design that we should be aware of. This involves data collection on more than one case at one particular point in time. So if you look at quantitative analysis or qualitative analysis or content analysis, the thing that unifies the three with cross-sectional designs is that all of their interview techniques are done at a single point in time. So in quantitative research, you can look at survey research or structured observation. Qualitatively, you can look at interviews or focus groups at a single point in time. And content analysis would be the assessment of a document or some thing that you want to assess with words, for example, that are done at one particular point in time. Finally, longitudinal studies are quite popular in social science research. In longitudinal studies, what we're doing is we're looking at the same cases, the same respondents over a time series, over several times. So for example, if you're looking at potentially learning outcomes of students, you might want to measure them grade by grade or every other grade. Sometimes you want to measure literacy scores. There's a reason why our standardized tests in our high schools and our elementary schools happen at periodic years, grades 3, grade 6, and so on, because it allows us to get a further understanding of how the cohort changes and how the cohort's learning over time. So that is one important feature of longitudinal studies. It happens, again, in the different kinds of research, whether it's quantitative, qualitative, or in content analysis, and it's something you need to be aware of.
Well, there you have it. That's our first voyage into research methods. Now, I want you to take to heart some of the things that we've talked about today. First of all, you should have an understanding or start to develop an understanding of how you feel about research and the kind of epistemological or ontological orientations that you yourself might hold. I also want you to understand that by going through this lecture today, the goal is to make sure that you're equipped, and as someone who is attentive to research methods, how to actually criticize research, and it's the very early stages of this, between good research and bad research. I want you to get away from this idea that you don't agree with the conclusions of a research project, therefore the research project is not valid or not good enough for yourself. I want you to get away from that. I want you to be able to evaluate the research that you're reading based on reliability and replicability and validity and trustworthiness. This allows you to have a fuller army of tools that at your disposal to criticize work and to actually discover that some of the research you're encountering is actually done pretty well. So that's all for today folks. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.